My name is Heike Michelsen. I'm the Director of Programming in the Einaudi Center for International Studies. And it's really my pleasure to welcome all of you here on behalf of the Director of the Einaudi Center and also Vice Provost of International Affairs at Cornell University. And I'd like to welcome you to this roundtable discussion to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the Rwandan Genocide. I particularly like to welcome our very distinguished guests today here, Adama Dieng, the UN Secretary General Special Advisor for the Prevention of Genocide, and also Consoli Nishimbi, a survivor of the 1994 Rwandan Genocide, to Cornell. This event today here is jointly organized by the Institute for African Development and the Einaudi Center, and is part of the newly launched roundtable discussion series that features experts in international affairs who can address topical issues from a variety of perspectives. It is another flagship of the Foreign Policy Forum at the Center, and this forum emerged from the understanding that Cornell needs to contribute to important debates on global affairs and to maximize the intellectual input of Cornell's outstanding resources in this area. Last week, Monday, thousands of people came together in the Amahoro Stadium in Kigali as Rwanda began a week of official mourning to mark the 20th anniversary of the genocide. At least 800,000 people, mostly ethnic Tutsis and moderate Hutus, died at the hands of Hutu extremists. Rwanda's President Paul Kagame and UN Secretary General Mr. Ban Ki-moon lit a torch which will burn for 100 days, the length of the time the genocide lasted during the spring of 1994. The UN is still ashamed over its failure to prevent this genocide, said Mr. Ban Ki-moon at this event. Today, we're here not only to commemorate this historical event, but also to have a distinguished expert panel on the relevance of the Rwandan genocide for current conflicts. It is my pleasure now to invite Cornell Professor Kifle Gebremedhin from the Department of Biological and Environmental Engineering and chair of the Institutes for African Development Advisory Committee, who will moderate the event today and introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My task is to moderate this session, the round discussion. The difficult aspect of it is how I should introduce our distinguished guests and also professors here at Cornell, because their resume is too long. And because of the distinguished nature of it, I was puzzled what to cut and what to say. Nevertheless, I will say a few words about each and every one of them. Before I came here, I Googled to see if the world has learned anything about the Rwandan genocide. And I found an article written by Timothy McGrath, which was written on April 8, 2014 in the Global Post. And it says, the title of it is 7 Armed Conflicts the World Failed to Stop, proving we have learned little from the Rwandan genocide. And he listed 7 of these conflicts, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Liberia, Sudan, Syria, and others, and even put numbers of people killed in these conflicts. So the conclusion is that even though the world said never again, the world hasn't learned anything about genocide, is the conclusion. So with that, let me introduce our keynote speaker. Our keynote speaker today, as mentioned earlier, and you have it in writing, is Adama Dieng, who will be speaking to us on this Rwandan genocide and its relevance for current conflict. Mr. Dieng is a legal and human rights expert currently working in the capacity of UN Secretary General's Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide. Mr. Dieng is a graduate of law from Dhaka University and holds certificates from different places, such as the Research Center of the Hague Academy of International Law, and also from the Paris Institute of International High Studies on Homeland Security. Mr. Dieng began his career as a registrar of the regional and labor courts in Senegal, worked for International Commission of Jurists, and for the last 10 years as a UN Secretary General, as I said, for human rights. During his period, he was appointed as envoy of the UN Secretary General to Malawi and as independent expert to Haiti. He also served as the Registrar of International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. Mr. Dieng's contributions include, just to mention a few, such as establishment of non-government organizations and strengthening African institutions, fighting impunity and promoting capacity building of judicial and democratic institutions. And he was the driving force behind the establishment of the African Court on Human and People's Rights, as well as in drafting the African Union Convention on Preventing and Combating Corruption. With that short introduction, I would like to call Mr. Dieng, and I'll introduce the other speakers later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. I would like, first of all, to say how pleased I am to visit again Cornell University, which is, I would say, one of the pearls of the academic world. And today, I'm extremely pleased to share with you a few moments to address you on the topic of Rwanda genocide and its relevance for current conflicts. My acceptance of this invitation to come here was partly premised not only on the importance of the subject, but also on the great importance I attach on the critical role of academic institutions in fostering rule of law and respect for human rights through cutting-edge research and training of future leaders. I'm therefore delighted that I could have an opportunity to interact with you on this important subject, knowing that it is through this kind of dialogue that the prevention of genocide and other atrocity crimes can become a reality. 20 years ago, almost 1 million people in Rwanda were slaughtered in the most senseless tragedy, a tragedy that completely defies human imagination. A few days ago, I accompanied the Secretary General to Kigali and participated in the 20th anniversary to mark the commemoration of the 1994 genocide. The occasion was extremely moving, and I felt honored to be part of it. I was encouraged to see so many government, international and regional institutions, and civil societies represented at the ceremony in Kigali. For me, this high level of attendance not only reflected our duty to remember those who perished in this tragedy, but also our steadfast commitment to preventing the occurrence of such a tragedy again. Rwanda remains and will always remain a scar on the conscience of humanity. It is important that the horrors of the 1994 genocide in Rwanda should galvanize our enduring commitment to never again. And it is also unfortunate, as Professor just mention that we still live in a world where the potential of genocide is high and real. Since the Rwanda tragedy, we have continued to witness gross violations of human rights and other atrocities being committed against innocent civilians in different parts of the world. Whether in Darfur, the Central African Republic, South Sudan, or Syria, millions of people around the world have perished, while others have been condemned to leave their home to seek sanctuary in faraway lands. It is this reality that we must reflect upon and confront if we are to make good our promise to prevent genocide and other atrocity crimes. While the Genocide Convention makes it clear that the primary duty of the international community is to prevent, too often we have failed to fulfill this duty with devastating consequences. The ongoing carnage in Syria clearly underscores my point. It is a well-recognized principle in international relations that states have exclusive authority to determine what happens in their territories, and that no other state or external institution can intervene without express agreement. Indeed, this recognition is well captured by the United Nations Charter, which reiterates that, and I quote, "Nothing should authorize intervention in matters essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state," end quote. By emphasizing the sanctity of states to determine their destiny without external interference, the Charter was reaffirming its profound aspiration for peaceful coexistence among all states, both rich and poor, or mighty and weak. Yet, we must agree that while the Charter was adopted in the quest to create a peaceful world among states and rid the world of the scourge of war, the Charter did not grant an automatic license for states to treat their people any way it pleases them. Indeed, it is the same Charter that, while recognizing the sovereign right of state to determine their affairs without external interference, declares that external intervention shall not be used save in the protection of common interest. However, the phrasing of the Charter leaves us in a dilemma with many questions unanswered. If I may echo the words of former Secretary General Kofi Annan, what are the common interests? Who determines or identifies them? Who is the guarantor of these interests? And perhaps a more difficult scenario is who should act to protect them. These are questions that we must reflect upon and find answers if we are to protect the weak in our midst and maintain peaceful coexistence among nations and nationalities. Recognizing the imperative of prevention, in 2004, the Secretary General established the Office of the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide. The establishment of this office should therefore be seen as a response to the failure of the international community to prevent what happened in Rwanda in 1994, what happened in Srebrenica in 1995. My mandate on the prevention of genocide is therefore very much connected to the lessons that we have learned from our failure in Rwanda. Following up on this initiative of the Secretary General, in 2005 at the World Summit, the UN member states made a commitment to protect their populations from atrocity crimes. In this declaration, states acknowledge and reaffirm the responsibility to protect their populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, as well as from their incitement. This was the first such international commitment to protect population from atrocity crimes. The responsibility to protect does not, nor does it purport to shift the primary role of states to protect their own people onto the international community. Rather, it reinforces the claim that states should undertake to fulfill this role as part of their legal and political duties towards their people. In the event that the state lacks the capability, it should strive to seek support to effectively discharge this obligation. It is only when the state fails to respond to the protection needs of its people that the international community can undertake appropriate measures consistent with the Charter to protect affected populations. While it is obvious that the international community at the United Nations level has played a key role in creating an effective genocide prevention framework, especially in the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide, it is equally true that at the regional level, the role of the African Union member states has tremendously evolved to respond to this reality. It has evolved from being a spectator to massive violations of human rights on the continent to being an active partner in the prevention of atrocities. And as most would agree, there have been laudable efforts on the prevention of genocide and other atrocity crimes in Africa since the establishment of the African Union. Perhaps these efforts can and indeed should be considered within the historical context of the African continent, and especially against what happened in Rwanda. As most of you academics and researchers know, Africa has seen its fair share of gross violations of human rights and atrocities, which have inflicted enormous suffering on its people. While in the aftermath of independence and subsequent years, the then Organization of African Unity, OAU, adopted various instruments for the protection of human rights, these instruments achieved little in protecting civilians against mass atrocities. And of course, the main reason was that sovereignty and the principle of non-intervention in the affairs of other countries were sacrosanct and indeed the raison d'etre of the OAU itself. With the dawn of this last century, when OAU transitioned to the AU, we witnessed a renewed commitment from the continental body to the prevention of atrocity crimes and protection of civilians. And as I said earlier, this renewed sense of commitment should be seen in the light of the Rwandan genocide, which had taken place while the continental body stood aside. This new commitment was fully enshrined and reflected in the Constitutive Act, a founding instrument of the African Union. Essentially, the Constitutive Act reiterates the African Union commitment against impunity, promotes peaceful coexistence of and among states, respect for the rule of law and human rights, and collective intervention in internal affairs of state members to protect civilians against atrocity crimes, including war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity. These efforts were further concretized by the establishment of the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. Increasingly, the African Union and other regional and sub-regional bodies on the continent have been taking proactive steps to enhance their capability to prevent atrocity crimes. The United Nations African Union hybrid intervention in Darfur, AMISOM's role in Somalia, the SADC intervention in Burundi and the DRC, and ECOWAS roles in Liberia and Sierra Leone, all collectively demonstrate the renewed commitment of the African Union and regional bodies to preventing atrocities. Certainly, it is true that these bodies have fallen short in their preventive role, as we continue to witness human suffering, whether in the Central African Republic or elsewhere. However, what I want to emphasize here is that the AU and its regional economic communities have moved a long way to be where they are today. I believe that increasingly, the AU is gaining the required political will and capability to realize the objectives of preventing atrocity crimes. In fact, even in the current anarchy in CAR, the African Union, working closely with the international community, has deployed a peacekeeping mission, MISCA, which is playing a key role in lessening human suffering. I just returned from Bangui, and I can tell you, if MISCA was not there, we would have today faced certainly another genocide. And I should insist that it is imperative that further efforts be taken if we don't want another genocide to happen in the African continent. So, ladies and gentlemen, another relevance of the Rwanda genocide to current conflict may be seen in the justice and accountability context. In the aftermath of the Rwanda genocide, the new Rwandan authorities requested the international community through the United Nations Security Council to set up an international tribunal in order to prosecute the perpetrators of the genocide and other gross violations of international humanitarian law. The establishment of the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, ICTR, was therefore a response to this request. We often think of justice as a mechanism for accountability that is used to address events of the past. And there are good reasons for this. Justice has to do primarily with the past. The primary objective of any judicial process is the provision of impartial and equitable justice. However, undertaking judicial processes particularly related to the prosecution of atrocity crimes has all the important outcomes that are linked to prevention. These include the deterrence of future crimes, the strengthening of reconciliation processes, and the maintenance of peace and security. All of these are consequences of justice when applied fairly and impartially. I can draw from my own experience from my previous role as the registrar of the ICTR and say that this tribunal, together with the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, played a key role in galvanizing international efforts to establish a permanent international criminal court. The preamble of the Rome Statute, among other things, expresses a determination to put an end to impunity for the perpetrators of these crimes and thus to contribute to the prevention of such crimes. End of quote. What we note here is the nexus between accountability and the prevention of atrocity crimes. And I strongly believe that holding to account individuals most responsible for serious crimes like genocide or war crimes may significantly contribute to preventive measures and may indeed serve as a deterrent to others. Beyond our legal or moral obligation, the pursuit of justice gives victims the opportunity to obtain a form of redress for the gross and systematic violations not only of international legal norms, but also of their own person and dignity. And that is why I should say that recently I was a bit worried with some movement regarding African leaders who were trying to undermine the International Criminal Code. And what appears to me as more worrisome, and which I would like to take a moment and reflect on with you, is this emerging wave, I refer it, this emerging wave in Africa that disparages international criminal justice, that presents it more as a problem than an adequate response to massive violations of human rights. The charges started with complaints against the selectivity of an international justice that goes only after soft targets, mostly African, while turning a blind eye on others outside the continent. More recently, the dismissal seems to be gaining steam in some quarters. Arrest warrants issued by the ICC are ignored. The jurisdiction of the court against head of states is being called into question, if not rejected altogether, with a call to create an African criminal court or to enlarge the jurisdiction of the African Court on Human and People's Rights. To these many expressions of dissatisfaction or distrust towards the current international criminal justice, powerful voices are now giving the ideological blessing the theoretical weapon to question its legitimacy. What the proponents of this line are saying basically is that justice cannot be, should not be the priority in torn and divided societies emerging from civil wars, because justice is inherently a blaming exercise, pointing fingers to people supposedly guilty versus those labeled as victims. It is ill-suited to bring together a divided society. It offers no incentive for people to lay down arms, make peace, and reunite. My take on this debate is that justice, particularly in the context of transition of civil war, is difficult to operate and is usually not perfect in many respects. But to wipe it away on account of its imperfection does not seem to me fair or even realistic. Those who perpetrate crimes like genocide are very often unapologetic. The ideology underlying those crimes make their perpetrators believe that they are doing good. They are removing evil through their acts. The Judicial Forum is one of those rare places where reconsideration, re-evaluation of their acts can be undertaken. And a mere political settlement can give rise to tactical concessions, but does not necessarily result in stopping demonizing the enemy. The Judicial Forum imposes predetermined values to all actors. The sanctity of human life cannot be dismissed. The origin, ethnicity, gender, or spiritual creed is equal. This straitjacket is, of course, very uncomfortable to those who believe in some form of superiority of one group towards others, which is the fuel for genocide. This explains why, in the beginning of the judicial process, many accused persons would defy the court, refuse to lend its legitimacy, to acknowledge its existence. But as the process is relentlessly set on motion, attitude change. Accused may deny what they are alleged to have done, but at least they are no longer claiming it righteous. This is already the beginning of an interesting process of acknowledgement of the other as worthy of respect, as an equal human being. I have served the international justice for over a decade. I have witnessed this process firsthand. During the first trials of the Rwandan genocide, most of the accused persons were quite worried about the ICTR, while they believed that our judges took their orders from the new regime in Kigali. We were also confronted with the opposite view. The government of Kigali and the victims were impassioned to see conviction handed down. They were frustrated that death penalty would not be part of the sanctions meted out. Finally, those detainees, they found that they were being treated too well in prison. Acquittal was out of question because they believed that the involvement of many figures was beyond dispute. But as the tribunal proceeded in its business, fair trial rights were affirmed, harsh sentences were pronounced, but acquittals too. Over time, a real shift in attitude has emerged, with both sides acknowledging that they must live with those rulings even if they would have preferred a different outcome. This process may feel unsatisfactory, particularly when people hold a legitimate view that they have not been fully vindicated. But we have nothing better than this imperfect tool we call justice. In the absence of justice, what we have would be the dictate of those who can up the beam of the balance to their side. And in saying this, I do not mean to downplay the role of the political process in the aftermath of civil wars. I accept that the political process may even require justice be deferred to give more chance to peace. The ICC statute makes room for this scenario under the responsibility of the Security Council. But it would be a mistake to make use of this mechanism just to give respite or getaway to powerful political actors. And I have insisted on this aspect because during my recent mission to Central African Republic, I witnessed firsthand how human rights violations can spill into atrocities against innocent civilians if they are not addressed. I'm sure you all have seen the documentaries of what is happening right now on our eyes in Central African Republic. When state institutions are weak, corrupt, or in some cases unavailable, the United Nations institution, regional, and other organizations that may be present on the ground have the responsibility to raise the alarm about impending atrocities. This is one reason why my office continues to explore ways to enhance coordination of our efforts with other partners within and outside the United Nations system to ensure that information on early warning of potential atrocities is shared with relevant stakeholders for quick action. And I believe that working closely with other stakeholders, both in the field and at the policy level, can significantly enhance our ability to recognize, and respond in a timely way to these violations as potential precursor of atrocities. Civilians have increasingly become the key target of violence in armed conflict, as we have witnessed in various instances of mass atrocities in recent years. Civilians, including women and children, are no longer just caught in crossfire. They have become a direct target of violence, enduring terrible crimes, including rape and forcible recruitment by warring rebel factions. It is an unfortunate development that compels us to enhance both international and regional efforts to protect civilians. Both state and non-state actors have a duty to ensure that the legal and physical protection of civilians is guaranteed in the context of armed or non-armed conflict. These actors must be constantly reminded of their obligations under international humanitarian law to protect civilians. Whenever civilians are deliberately targeted because they belong to a particular community or ethnic group, it is evident that we are confronting potential or indeed actual genocide. We can no longer afford to be blind to this grim dynamic, nor should we imagine that appeals to morality without credible threat of action will have much effect on people who have adopted a deliberate strategy of killing and forcible expulsion. Anyone who embarks on genocide commits a crime against humanity. It is therefore important that humanity responds by taking action in its own defense. It is our collective obligation to stand firm and provide a shield to the defenseless. Genocide almost always occurs during war. So, one of the best ways to reduce the chances of genocide is to address the causes of the conflict. I must, however, say that while these efforts are critical to prevention and resolution of conflicts, and indeed have made significant contribution to this effect, we have to move beyond early warning to early action. We have to strengthen our institutions to respond in a timely and effective way to potential conflicts and general threat to peace and security. Even the best system of early warning will be useless if states are unable or unwilling to take action when the warning is received. And despite the continued support of the member states, we are still short of the prevention threshold enshrined in the Genocide Convention. We are still confronted with realities in our limitation and political will to act. The ongoing carnage in Syria is a stark reminder of our limitation and ability to undertake robust action to protect populations from atrocity crimes. Yet this inaction is unacceptable, especially for those who endure the suffering resulting from this conflict. We need to do more, and we can do more. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, I can state that I, for one, do not believe that genocide has to occur for us to find better ways of preventing genocide. The best lesson we can draw from the tragedy in Rwanda is our commitment to build and strengthen existing institutions to better respond to potential acts that may serve as a precursor to genocide. We can demonstrate our commitment to the prevention of atrocity, crimes, if our vision for the future is informed by an enduring commitment to the rule of law, protection of fundamental rights and freedom of our people, equitable development premised on social and economic justice, and strong institutions to guarantee peaceful resolution of our differences. And I strongly believe that prevention is a better strategy than intervention after the fact. As former registrar of the ICTR, I too well understand the price of inaction. I speak from painful experience when I say that serious human rights violations are the best early warning of likely genocide and other atrocity crimes. Prevention of mass atrocities must start, therefore, with addressing day-to-day human rights violations. We will be paying tribute to the victims of the Rwanda Genocide if we commit ourselves to protecting human rights of all peoples, particularly the vulnerable, preventing conflicts before they can break out, protecting civilians in the event conflicts occur, and holding to account those who instigate and support such violence and atrocity crimes. I thank you for listening.
So now we have our panelists in place. I will introduce each one of them, and they will speak in the order of their presentation or their introduction. Our first speaker of the panel is Consele Nishiwe. She is on the left of Mr. Dieng. Consele is a survivor of the 1994 genocide against Tutsis in Rwanda. Born in Western Province, she lived through the horrors of genocide at the age of 14. She was at her home with her parents and 4 siblings when the genocide started, and forcing them to leave their home and go into hiding. Unfortunately, her father and 3 young brothers were murdered along with many other close relatives. Consele suffered physical torture during her 3 months in hiding and miraculously survived with her mother and younger sister. In 2001, Consele migrated to the United States, where she has taken a progression of steps to overcome the multifaceted traumatic events she suffered during the genocide and to chart a new course of her life. In 2012, Consele released her memoir, Tested to the Limit, a genocide survivor's story of pain, resilience, and hope. She is a committed speaker on the genocide and advocate for the survivors who suffered physical and emotional torture, and a defender of human rights. In recognition of her courage and accomplishments, Consele was awarded the 2013 Living Legacy Award from the African Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and the Step Up Service Award from the Rwandan women called the Insanga. Our second speaker is familiar to you. Muna Ndulo is a professor of law at Cornell Law School and director of the Institute of African Development. Professor Ndulo is an internationally recognized scholar in the fields of constitution making, governance and institution building, human rights, and foreign direct investment. He was formerly professor of law and dean of the School of Law at the University of Zambia, served for 10 years as legal officer in the International Trade Law branch of the UN Commission on International Trade Law. And he worked as a political and legal advisor with the UN Observer Mission in South Africa, East Timor, Kosovo, and Afghanistan, acted as a consultant to the Kenya 2010 constitution process, the 1999 Zimbabwe constitution process, and now in 2012, in the Somalia's constitution process. I don't know how he missed Eritrea in all this, but in addition, he is on the board of directors of the African Association of International Law and on the advisory committee of Human Rights Watch. Professor Ndulo earned a master's in law from Harvard and a PhD from Oxford. Our last but not least speaker is also familiar to you. Nicholas van der Wal is the Maxwell M. Absen Professor of Government and former chair of the Department of Government at Cornell. Before that, he served...
6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago.
Still is? Okay. My apologies. Before that, he served as an associate professor at Michigan State University. That's close to my heart because my daughter went to school there. Professor van der Wal was a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development and the Overseas Development Council. He has published widely on democratization issues as well as on the politics of economic reform and on the effectiveness of foreign aid with a special focus on Africa. In addition, he has worked extensively as a consultant for a variety of international and multilateral organizations, including the World Bank, USAID, and UNDP. His latest book is a CGD publication, Overcoming Stagnation in 8 Development Countries. Professor van der Wal primarily field is comparative politics, and his teaching and research focus is on the political economy of development with a special emphasis on Africa, on democratization, and on the politics of economic reform. Professor van der Wal earned his PhD from Princeton. With that short introduction, our speakers will speak in that order. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well? Okay, good. Yeah, I think this stuff, I don't need this anymore. Yeah. So can you hear me well? Great, okay. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Thank you for your hard work, and I thank you very much for your message today. And I thank you all for being here with me, and thank you very much for inviting me today to be here with all of you to share with you and remember and honor the memories of our loved ones we lost 20 years ago. Thank you very much. It means so much to me that you are taking your time to commemorate. So thank you very much. 20 years ago, I was 14 years old. I lived in a small town, not in Kigali, in the capital. So I lived in the Western Province in Kibuye. It used to be called Kibuye, but now it's Western Province. So I was among the 5 siblings, so I was the 5th. I was the oldest, 14 years old. And my younger sister and my other 3 brothers from age 9, 7, and almost 18 months old. And my parents were teachers in the community, and I had a big family, my grandparents, uncles, cousins, and it was very nice. I had a very good childhood, but I never expected that it would just cut short without experiencing the best thing my parents were planning for me. My parents were good parents, and they were working hard, looking forward for me to go in school and be able to have a good life. But that really cut off immediately without even thinking that will happen. I remember early before the genocide started, when I was actually in school, that's when I started realizing how Tutsis were hated. So for me, it wasn't very much that I knew very much because I was so young, but somehow I really experienced some of mistreatment in school. So when I remember in junior high, one of the nieces of the mayor used to actually bully me at school, along with many other Tutsis, and I didn't know very much until I I realized it was very hard for me even to sit in front of her. Then I asked my teacher to move me from the seat. So that's the only thing actually they could do. Nothing much they could do about that. So I remember that experience. When the genocide began, I remember when in a town, I was both with my parents at home and when I heard on the radio myself, because everybody had a radio at home, so we used to hear what was being talked on the radio. I remember myself hearing that the Tutsis will be killed over the country, and the hatred, words and messages that was being sent through the radio and calling all our neighbors to kill us. And for me, growing up, my parents really had told me to be respectful to everyone. We never had a conversation in the household talking about ethnics or if anyone is a Hutu or Tutsi. But for some reason, my parents, later on, my mom explained to me that she used to face a lot of mistreatment along with my father because of being a Tutsi at work. So, but then I remember when we were there hearing that, and it was actually, we lived not far from the mayor's office, and there were so many people actually were coming from different area, going to the mayor's office, and their homes were being burned down because already they started killing people in some part of the country. And I remember when he actually was telling them to go in the communal office so they can get there around in the sitting down over there. So what he wanted, he just wanted to have everybody there so they could kill them easily. So, and I remember seeing, it was so hard for me to see immediately things changing, and all of a sudden, the people who couldn't even walk by themselves, and the old women, walking on their sticks and don't have anything, they are running and asking for help, and kids, with their moms on their back. And I have that image in my mind. I remember, when he decided, actually we're at the Muslim community, that's where we were. It was almost close to that communal office. So that's where we went and leaving our home, thinking that probably we will be safe. So in our mind, even though we were hearing what was happening, somehow people really believed that that will be a genocide. No one was believing that they are going to kill us the way they did it. So, and I remember when the mayor decided to tell everybody, they say you have to go to the stadium. So many people, just went on the main road and just went to the stadium. I remember when the people who was actually helping us in that Muslim community, they said, I think you are going to be killed. You have to go and find somewhere to hide because this is not going to be safe for you. And we decided to follow everybody on the road. And it was a huge crowd of people. I will never forget the songs they were singing and calling to God, can you help us, these trials and tribulation we're going through. I will never forget the image of everyone calling and don't have any help and support, and they were just following everything they're telling them to do. And when we followed the crowd, I don't know what, my mom, somehow instincts came through her, and she said, I don't think we should follow the crowd and go to the stadium. And she said, let's just go to someone who was a good friend of theirs somewhere, walking when we're not far from the main road where everybody was going to the stadium. And then we went there. I remember on our way, I saw so many people carrying machetes, and they had these big, thick wooden, they used to call them, in Kinyarwanda, they used to call them Ntampongano y'umwanzi, which means no pity for our enemies. So they had these nails on top, and they actually were carrying in clubs on the way and having banana leaves around their waist and singing, and we are going to exterminate them, we are going to kill all these cockroaches. I remember being so scared, as you can imagine, at 14 years old. You don't know, when you see that, it's really terrifying. You don't know what to think about. So, and I remember when we went there, we ran in that house, and these people took us in the sitting. And my paternal aunt was with us at that time. She managed to come with us. And also a young lady who was a Hutu who was with us, living with us at home, helping us in the house. And she actually refused to go to her home. We begged her. We told her, please go to your parents' house because you might be killed. So you are Hutu, just go to your parents. And she refused. She said, you've been so kind to me, and I will stay with you. And she came with us, and we went in our house, and these people took us in the ceiling. And I don't know how to explain you how the ceiling looked like at that time. But we managed to be up in the ceiling, and we were like in many. We went in different rooms, and I remember being up in the ceiling, hearing people chanting, songs of going to exterminate the Tutsis, and that was very, very terrifying for me. I couldn't find words to describe how, fearful I was. And I remember sometimes you never knew that, someone would change. And these people, even though they were good friends of us, they didn't want to keep us any longer. So they said early, in the night that we have to leave and go figure out somewhere else to go. And I remember at that night, when I realized that is our beginning of pain and suffering. When I saw us, being in the bushes in the night, and it was, as a kid, myself, even though we didn't have much, but our parents really took care of me, and finding myself outside with my siblings and laying down on the ground and in the stones and don't know where we were going, it was very tough for me. And I remember early in the morning when we were figuring out where to hide, and we were actually sitting in a sorghum plantation around the river. These killers came early in the morning, because actually at that time they used to get up early in the morning and going to kill people and singing and chanting. And I remember that, the singing, the songs, they came through me like a sharp knife, the way they were singing, and so terrifying. And while we were singing there, my mom just kept saying we're sitting and so terrifying. She was the only one who had the strength to tell all of us to pray. And she said, whatever is going to happen, let us stay together, keep praying within your hearts, no matter what's going to happen. If something happens, at least we'll be together. And we sat over there, and these killers came around and say, whatever cockroaches, the snake, where you are hiding, come out before we kill you so badly. By hearing that, I was like, I don't know how I was shaking and don't know what to do. And somehow, when they approached, we decided to come out from the bushes. And then when we went outside, my aunt ran a different direction because she was very, very scared. And the young girl also ran a different direction. The rest of us, we were together, we stuck together. And my other siblings later on told me the way my aunt was killed, that these killers murdered her. And while on our way, I remember my dad if they took everything he had in his pockets, the money. Of course, we didn't have much things. We didn't manage to carry too much stuff with us. And it was during the day, and the killers were all over the place and searching, and at the roadblock, you didn't know where to go, because on the main street, they had all these roadblocks, and you had to make sure that you go through the bushes. But even in the bushes also, it was very difficult because we were searching everywhere. And what we did, we just kept going. It was during the day, and we went up to the hill and figured out somewhere to hide. And I remember when we reached up to one of the hills facing where we lived to our home, and looking up many homes, my grandparents' homes, our home, everything was destroyed. And I couldn't believe what I was seeing. When we got over there, my dad was holding my younger brother in his hand, and the rest of us were following. And I remember these killers started calling and mentioning my dad's name because, of course, living in a town, when you're a teacher, most people know your name, and they started calling each other that they found a Tutsi Ngoga, with his family. So, and this young woman, when we got close to their home, she took my younger brother from my dad's hand, and she said, "Everyone follow me." And my dad had to go in different direction because he didn't want all of us to be together. And these killers decided to follow my dad, and the rest of us went in the house, and these people took us again in the city. That's the only place they could find to take us. And when we were there, I remember later in the evening, these killers have been all over the place, and they were actually, you could hear, because the houses were not very tall, you could hear what people are saying, drinking. Actually, they were drinking beers, traditional beers, and they call it banana beers. So they were rewarding themselves for what they have been doing throughout the day, saying that they have done a good work. So, and I remember when they mentioned so many people they have murdered, I couldn't believe hearing them saying that they have murdered my dad, they have been following too. So it was very hard for me hearing my dad, who used to be a good friend, and being murdered with just simply being a Tutsi. It was the hardest thing for me. And I remember holding each other with my mom, and we were crying, and I was telling her, maybe we should come out so we can be killed. I couldn't believe what happened. So, and my mom, we tried and kept hiding over there. It was very hard, and these people didn't want to keep us again any longer. So, and during those times, you had to figure out where to go, because these people have changed completely. You didn't know who was kind, who was, everybody have changed completely, because they have adopted this bad ideology of hating Tutsis. And I remember, because we went to so many places throughout the 3 months in hiding. So I remember this particular place we went, myself, my mom, and my siblings. Of course, my father was already killed. Actually, he was killed on April 15th, which is 2 days ago. It was hard, and we had to go through the bushes. It was a rainy season. My mom had to carry my younger brother because he couldn't walk by himself. And a lot of times when we were in the bushes, I remember my mom would just look all of us, and when she used to help us, but she can't do anything, it was very hard for her. Sometimes she had her face without showing me that she was crying. And my younger brother asking to go back home, and hungry, asking food. And I remember this place we went, this woman used to be a neighbor of my mom for so long. And when we got there and we knocked the door, we were so wet and muddy, our feet and bruised. And I remember when we got there, when my mom knocked the door, she mentioned who she was. And these kids in the house, it happened to be that my mom was their teacher. And the woman was part of the killing, and her husband as well. Another time when we went there, the husband was at the roadblock killing people. And when we knocked the door, the woman refused. When she kept refusing, the kids kept crying and begging her that they should help. Mom, can you help our teacher and her kids to come in the house and come out of the rain? I remember, because of the kids, she accepted to take us in the house. And that was the time that she looked at it. She said, I could not have done anything to help a Tutsi. I never loved a Tutsi in my life. And because of my kids, that's the reason why I accept to do this. And when she took us in the house, she said, my husband is going to kill you no matter what when he comes back. But for some reason, I don't know, because of what the kids have kept telling her, she managed to took us early in the morning in one of the small house that was belonging to her mother-in-law many years ago, who passed away, and nobody else was living in that house. And she took us there and she locked the door outside. When she locked the door and she left, and the husband came early in the morning with this killer, and somehow they wanted to go back in that house to get, I don't know, probably they had so many things they have taken from the Tutsis' homes. And I remember hearing them arguing outside, and somehow the woman gave them the key and they went in the house. And the guy who came was someone who used to be my mom's neighbor growing up when they were young. So across the street, he came with a machete and he raised it and started screaming and say, "I'm going to kill you, Jean, with your little cockroaches." And as kids, we begged him until he said, "I'm not going to do it now, but I will let you go and just, find somewhere else to go." And in those times, we really met people who were unkind in many different ways. And I remember another place we went, this man used to be a very good friend of my parents for so long, and my mom also had been trying to take us to many places to figure out where we can hide. And when we got there, this man came out in the house after we knocked the door, and he was wearing the towel around his waist and had a small drum in his hand. And he had a killer who was standing right there with a machete and a club, and he was waiting for his order so he can start killing us. And when he was there, he started calling the killers who were actually facing the high school where the roadblock was, and so many killers were there. So he knew that immediately everybody would come and kill us. And when he kept calling them, so no one answered. And he was so mad, he went back in the house. Actually, at that time, we were begging him, "Please, if you don't want to help us, just at least let us go." By the time he went back in the house, this killer, I don't know when it went through his mind, it was just a miracle. He just said, "Just leave." I don't think he never really left any Tutsi really surviving until that happened to us. And when we left, I remember another place we went, because people have been unkind in many different ways. And this woman used to be a good friend of my maternal grandparents for so long. And they were actually getting ready for Sabbath. And my mom was saying, because these are Christian people, maybe they are going to help us. It was during the night. And when we were knocking the door, this woman refused to open. She said, "Jean, you need to go, you need to leave. I'm getting ready for Sabbath." And in my mind, as I was, thinking, I say, this woman should have been so kind. She's getting ready for Sabbath. She should be kind, and because that's what God asked us to be. And we had no choice. We had to leave. She didn't help. And I remember this place also we went, when we were found by these killers, and my mom was taken by these killers along with my younger brother, and the rest of us kids stayed over there. And throughout the day, they have been taking her throughout the town and deciding who is going to kill her, how they are going to kill her. And by the end of the day, they decided not to do anything. They took her actually to somebody who was our neighbor, about 2 minutes walking. It was an old man who lost his leg. And they left her there. Actually, they came back to look for us. And somehow, as kids, we managed to go and found her. By the grace of God, we were able to find her, but it was very, very difficult. And when we found her, these killers already have saw that we are still alive. And in those times, to see the boys alive, it was almost like as if they've never done anything. So they said, "Why these boys are still alive?" And they decided to come to take my brothers. And we were begging them. And someone who came was someone who grew up with my mom again so many years. And he was at the front of everybody. He came and they snatched all my brothers from us, but at that time, I remember when my mom was telling us, all of us, she was saying, just keep praying. And that's the only thing we're doing. I remember when my brothers, especially the 9 years old and 7 years old, they were holding my younger one brother and saying, we are going to heaven to see our dad. It was very hard for all of us who were begging to be killed, but these people refused. And as you know, in those times they decided whatever girls we're gonna kill you whenever we want. So, and somehow we managed to go and hiding again because people there said you have to go and hide, and it was very tough. We were just going anywhere. And I remember for my mom, it was very hard. She didn't even want to go hide again because it was too difficult for her. After losing her sons who were brutally murdered, actually they took them to our burn house and slaughtered them and threw them in a septic tank. It was very hard. I remember when we kept hiding and went to this place also, and this man was part of the killing, and the woman was not. And she took us in the house, and this man came back with another killer who used to be my neighbor, actually even very close to my house. And this man, I've seen him many years in my life, and as you know, these people are the people that everybody who did what they did to us during the genocide, these are the people I've seen, I've known. And he decided to grab me from everybody, and everybody begged and said, if you want to kill these people, kill us, kill all of us together. He didn't want to, and he just beat me with a sword and dragged me on the street. And unfortunately, as you know, so many women and girls during the genocide, rape was used as a weapon. So many women around the country, and that happened to me. I didn't want to live anymore. And when you will survive something happen, and we were able to find a good Samaritan in the Muslim community who hid us until the country was liberated by the RPF, and then right after the genocide, we found out that so many people have been murdered. My grandparents and many other family members, almost on my dad's side, everybody was killed. Now I have a few people who survived on my mom's side. And later on, because throughout the years going through trauma and with everything that have happened to me, I was thinking that because of how my body was getting sick and getting weak, later on when I came in this country in 2001, that's when I got the courage to go get tested, and I found out that as a result of rape, I contracted HIV. It was very hard for me to live with both the trauma of suffering and losing people, rape, and now HIV. And it was very hard for me, but thankfully that my mom encouraged me to keep moving on and have hope and faith. And she was able to go back to work, and she told me not to be hateful and towards these people. And for me, throughout the years, I realized that if I will carry the hatred the same way these people have done it. So I won't help myself. I won't be able to live a healthy and fulfilling life. And even though it took me so many years to be able to tell my story, but I went through a journey of pain, but at the same time, I came to realize that I have to do the right thing and looking up to hope and faith in order for me to live a healthy and fulfilling life and look at life in a positive way. One of the messages that I can leave with you that I always have in my heart that helps me to live and be strong every day is that no matter what experience, no matter what circumstances you may face in your life, never lose hope. For losing hope is the beginning of your own self-defeat. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Under Secretary General, for that excellent presentation, and thank you, Consuelo, for your testimony about these very, very tragic events. And as the topic suggests, I mean, the question that really we have to confront is what lessons do we learn from this, and how has, what has the world done to make this never happen again? Now, of course, as I think the Under Secretary General pointed out, the sad part is that these atrocities, I mean, the crisis continue to happen. So clearly, the world still has to learn lots of lessons. As was pointed out, we have today Central African Republic, you have Syria, you have many other places. Now, what I would like to focus on in my comment would be a very specific issue that was raised in the Keynote address. This is the question of responsibility to protect, which is, I think, at least assumed, or at least most people would concur to say, has been strengthened since the Rwanda Genocide. So it's one of the reactions that the world has given to this. And I'll be very brief, but what I want to do is just simply to outline what it is, and then, of course, the issues and difficulties of actually implementing this concept. And as was pointed out, and also they take the lead that actually only yesterday the Security Council met and considered this topic of where we are with the responsibility to protect. And it was during a ceremony to commemorate the Rwanda genocide. So this was yesterday. And what they did is that in the first place, they reaffirmed the decision that they made, the World Summit made in 2005 to say that there is this concept of responsibility to protect. And it's been something that has been reiterated, reaffirmed several times really since then. Now, a large number of states have actually accepted this norm, although of course there are few still that contend that it's still a contested issue. But I think it's more really its a dimension that is, and according to the norm, one of the things that we, of course, was missing in Rwanda was the international response to this. And basically, the responsibility to protect, says that states have a responsibility to protect their populations from genocide and war crimes and ethnic cleansing and all that. And that means that the state should ensure that people under its jurisdiction are not subject to genocide and war crimes. And it also means that a state should take effective and credible measures to ensure that such things do not happen. And of course, the third aspect of it is that when they do happen, as happened in Rwanda, that we should punish those that perpetrate the atrocities and provide reparations to the victims of the genocide. Now, this of course means that really we must organize government apparatus. That is the way government exercises the power in such a way that we strengthen this norm, that it is possible to prevent, it's possible to, of course, punish people who carry out genocide. And of course, that means building institutions, as I think was pointed out, institutions of governance, the police, the judiciary, everything, so that in fact things are in place. And I think that there is no doubt that actually this norm, to me, existed even before 2005, in the sense that it's embedded in the Charter. You know, if you look at the UN Charter itself, it places the promotion and the encouragement of respect for human rights as one of its core purposes. And that is actually in the preamble of the Charter and the purposes. And it's accepted that the international community has the responsibility to use appropriate measures to deal with these issues. But however, I think that it's also, we should accept that these measures are most effective if they are undertaken at an early point. And I mean, the Rwanda case demonstrates that, and are carefully targeted and calibrated. And of course, that means that in fact, we have to develop a system where there is early warning, because I mean, how can you react unless there is early warning? So this, I think, to me, is a crucial element, that early warning is a critical element of this responsibility to protect. Without early warning, you will not be able to do the protection. And that, of course, also means that as you develop mechanisms for early warning, they must be at the regional level and at the international level. And to this extent, of course, we have some groups, like, for example, ECOWAS has done some work in this area, and that's encouraging. But I think there are still very significant problems with the early warning system. And I think that most people would say that there is insufficient focus, and there is insufficient institutional resources, even within the United Nations, to really carry out serious early warning. And if you look at the Rwanda genocide, you find that actually the early warning was coming from NGOs and, you know, the BBC and all these agencies are not really from the UN system. And I think this was acknowledged yesterday in the discussions in the UN. And I think the early warning system is crucial. And for it to be effective, it must be so structured that all the role players, like, you know, NGOs, are involved in creating a system that will alert us to this happening. And of course, it requires the development of things like the free press and all those systems. Now, and I think that part of early warning must really be this aspect of dealing with the conditions that create, or at least form the basis, or at least, you know, make it genocide possible. That we must address these issues. And these issues relate to a large extent on the questions of governance, that we must promote as an early warning measure, ensuring that governments are democratic, that there is intolerance, zero tolerance to regimes that are autocratic. We must promote human rights, and that intervention should be the last resort, because intervention, as was pointed out, is extremely expensive, and it's much cheaper to actually, it's much cheaper to prevent an event like genocide than to wait until genocide has happened and then you intervene at that point. And I think that it means that in communities where we know or see the potential for ethnic violence, that is important as part of the response to create an environment where such calls for non-violence and all that are accepted, and that we promote understanding among people. And I would also want to add that all factors considered, early warning, Rwanda, the problem wasn't really early warning, because we know that actually the international community knew, in terms of, we're also aware that the force commander in Rwanda, as early as January, warned that this thing might happen. This is General Dereo. But of course, his warnings were ignored. So really, the key factor after that is really the question of the political will. We have to have and develop the political will to actually act. Early warning, of course, is very important, because after all, I think as the Secretary General observed, it's true that action is highly unlikely without early warning. So we need it, but I think we also have to realize that we need the political will. The crisis in the Central African Republic is something that I think was known, that it was developing, just like the crisis in the Rwanda. And of course, the last big question that comes up with the early warning, I think, is this lack of development of a threshold. At what point do you actually say that there is sufficient human rights violation? Therefore, we intervene. Of course, there are also discussions as to, is this unilateral or should it be collective in terms of actually response? But I think the critical thing really is early warning. And one of the other problems is that I think as we develop this concept of early warning, and this is my last point, we have to really encourage cooperation between countries. Because often the security agencies of countries do know, but then there are different levels of competence, but they're very unwilling to share information in terms of what's happening on the ground. And somehow, and this is where maybe the UN can play a role in terms of coordinating this effort, building capacity within the UN to actually know what's likely to happen. And of course, also to study these communities and societies where there is the potential for this to happen, to see what are the root causes, what are the problems that are being addressed, so that we can actually begin to prevent the occurrence of genocide. And I'd like to emphasize the point that prevention is the best, is the very cheap compared to trying to intervene and stop the genocide. So I think I will end there and look forward to the contributions from the audience. And thank you very much.
Our last speaker is Nick.
Well, thank you. I should have been a warm-up act that was given half the time of the stars of the show. So let me be really brief. I can't offer either the sort of harrowing testimonial that we heard tonight, or the sort of wise and learned disquisitions on international law and on the international community. Let me just make really 2 or 3 brief comments on basically what have we learned since then, and how is Africa different today than it was 20 years ago? Both trying to answer the question of, could it happen again? If we, one thing that was perhaps not adequately said today was that the genocide in 1994, and I want to say also the several 100,000 Rwandans who died well after the 10-week period of that I think we've focused on a lot today, but the subsequent massacres, often outside of Rwanda, speak to the sort of regional mess, which was the Great Lakes region at this time, with a number of collapsed states and a region that had just gone through, well over a decade of dreadful economic crisis that had substantially weakened the social fabric in a country like Rwanda, but also in Uganda, also in then Zaire, and that I think contributed very much to the genocide. So I think the Great Lakes region is in much better shape today. I mean, there's still the major issue of the Congo, but the region is in better health than it was 20 years ago. The real region that we have to worry about in Africa today, as Undersecretary Dieng suggested, is the Sahel region and the region north, really going on a long belt from Somalia to Mauritania. We're not just a Central African Republic, but there are a number of states that are deeply vulnerable to the kind of general craziness that broke out in Rwanda in '94. So and we see the UN is once again playing a kind of early warning role in the Central African Republic. The Central African Republic has been a collapsed state that is just waiting for the kind of current outbreak of violence for almost a decade now. And the issues continue really unresolved in large parts of Sudan. Chad is a deeply troubled country. Mali and Niger now, with the combination of Tuareg unrest and Al-Qaeda pockets, is in trouble, and so on and so forth. So in the same way that in the early 90s we should have worried about the Great Lakes region, we should worry about the Sahel region today. So what have we learned? I think the really important lessons have been learned by the international community and the sort of body of international law that two of the speakers have spoken about. I think the performance of the UN was generally not very good in '94. The performance of the international NGOs was appalling often, particularly after the immediate events of '94. But the performance of the international NGOs in Eastern Zaire, or now Eastern Congo, was generally really poor. On the other hand, it led to a lot of thinking in that community. It led to the passage of different charters and standards of good behavior. And so I think if there was another outbreak, and for example in Syria, I think the performance of these same international NGOs has been much better. So I think there's been genuine learning. Has there been learning in Africa itself? I think so. On balance, I think, again, as has already been said, the AU is a much sounder organization today than it was 20 years ago. Is it sound enough? Does it have adequate resources? Probably not, but there has been real progress in that kind of international institution building in the AU. What about the West? I think there has been very little learning in the West. I think the kind of prevarication and hypocrisy which led Madeleine Albright to devote virtually all of her energies to denying that a genocide was going on in those 10 weeks, starting from middle of April, is still there. And we see a lot of it in debates about Syria today, where domestic politics and realpolitik push humanitarian concerns to a far back seat in a way that I think suggests a lot of the stuff that has happened before. I think, to be sure, Clinton's dramatic failure in Rwanda, his appalling failure to do anything, led to the intervention in Yugoslavia, in Bosnia Herzegovina 2 years later, in a way that was good. But this ability to intervene waxes and wanes, and I think actually that there's very little support in the U.S. The only country, by the way, which is capable of putting together a real intervention to do something militarily to prevent an ongoing genocide. That right now, there's very little domestic support in the U.S. for any kind of intervention, and which I think helps to explain the passivity in Syria. And that's due to the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, which have completely exhausted the American public. So I'm not really sure there's much learning there. Has there been much learning in Rwanda? You know, the Kagame regime has talked a lot about reconciliation, has talked a lot about making Rwanda kind of a post-ethnic society. But the truth is that the Gacaca process of reconciliation is largely viewed by the Hutu majority of the country as a winner's justice and not really an impartial justice. You know, the bottom line is that this regime would probably not win much more than 10 to 15% of the vote in a free and fair election. And that the fact that its coming to power in its first years in power was accompanied by considerable anti-Hutu violence is a mark which the Hutu will not forget immediately. It's a country that's been growing by, I think, an average of close to 10% since 1994, admittedly from a very, very low base since the country had been absolutely decimated. You know, Kagame sees himself as or he sees Rwanda under his tutelage as the Singapore of East Africa, and believes that rapid economic growth for another 20 years will eliminate the kinds of passions which led to the genocide. I don't know if he has 20 years in front of him, and I don't know if the current economic success story is sustainable, and maybe we could talk about that in a second. Could it happen again? No, sorry. So second sort of partial set of questions to answer this question, could it happen again, is what's changed in Africa? And I would say a couple things really are different that make another genocide a bit less likely. On the one hand, I've already said the AU is stronger, local institutions are stronger, the right to, the responsibility to protect doctrines, you know, offer a body of international law that is stronger. On the other hand, the economic conditions are really different. Africa is enjoying a second decade of rapid economic growth, and you know, there are relatively few countries, although, for example, the Central African Republic is one of them, that are sort of economically exhausted in a way that that decimates the social fabric. Technology. I prefer a sort of optimistic scenario about the impact of cell phones. I don't think Madeleine Albright could say today that no genocide is taking place, because I think there would be cell phone and smartphone evidence of it. On the other hand, the pessimistic scenario is that the current development of cell phones would have been used by the Interhamwe to plan out the genocide. I'm not really sure. And you know, there's been plenty of cell phone evidence of atrocities in Syria, and it hasn't really led to, I think, a much smarter reaction. So there, I think the story is you know, the impact is a wash. So I do think Africa is a different place. I think, as Muna suggested, you know, democracy is much more legitimate today. Military rule is much less legitimate than it once was. But there are a lot of countries in this region that is, on the whole, doing much, much better. There are a lot of countries that are not doing much better, where the conditions for a genocide are close to being met, and I think that should worry us. Our Central African Republic, CR, is just the most obvious case of this. And I'll stop there so we can have at least some questions. Thank you.
I feel compelled to point out that in the view of an awful lot of people, genocide is occurring today. It is occurring in Sudan. It is occurring in the Nuba Mountains. And all kinds of information is flowing in that way. The United Nations passed Resolution 2046 a long time ago, asking for some kind of agreement between the opposition in the Nuba Mountains and the Sudanese government. And then later on, about a year later, they had to admit that that resolution had failed. The United Nations has been opposed. At the same time, something else worth pointing out, I think, is that the people who have learned the lessons from Rwanda are the genocidaire, or the potential genocidaire. If one takes a place like Burma, where the Rohingya minority in Burma is being persecuted in scenes and in styles and in ways that indeed adumbrate very clearly a genocide, and yet the radical Buddhists who are inciting these kinds of pogroms that are going on, we learned from a major activist in the case of pro-Burma activist at that time, human rights activist and so forth. She said that in fact what's going on now is that radical Burmese monk who is inciting these kinds of attacks is deliberately avoiding certain language that would put him in the area of defining a genocide. He's not using exterminatory language, but he's using every other kind of attack language that he can. But he's learned his lesson, that if he does not use words like kill them all or exterminate, he'll be able to get away with that. And he is not even being opposed by the leading human rights activist or previous activist in the country, someone who won the Nobel Prize for Peace, Aung San Suu Kyi, has said nothing about this. So you have a real potential for whatever you want to call it, a crime against humanity, a mass atrocity. You use the language, it's there. The United Nations has condemned this. They have made statements against these kinds of events, but there has been no action. There has been nothing like that. So I would make those two cases that right now we have a potential genocide going on, a potential reduction in the variety of the human fabric, taking out one of those tiles in the human mosaic in Burma, and it has been happening since June of 2011, if not 20 years before, in the Nuba Mountains, and nothing has happened. And the United Nations has done nothing effective.
Can I have 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll get the answers after that? Yes, sir. Would you make your questions very brief, please?
I'll try to be as humble as I can. So, one genocide that I noticed was not mentioned in the long list of genocides that have occurred since I was born was the genocide perpetrated against the Kurds and the Shia in Iraq. And going off of that, the 2 genocides that are essentially being declared each on the other, Sunni versus Shia, which is currently the largest and bloodiest conflict in the world, of which the conflict in Syria is in many ways a microcosm. So where does the United States stand when young liberal people of my generation are saying things like, well, can't we sit this one out when they hear about Syria? Or, well, we can't be the world police. Where do we go? I mean, the one country, as Professor Dr. Van der Waal said, the one country that has the military capability and even the political capability and willingness to do anything has a liberal base that could not care less. This is not just right-wing isolationism of the beginning of the 20th century. This is 21st century, know-nothing left-wingers. I mean, where do we go from here?
Last question.
I want to push Professor Van der Waal a little bit on his application of the Rwanda lessons to Syria. So there's no doubt that the Assad regime supporters are committing mass atrocities, violating human rights. But there is not an intent to destroy whole or part a national, ethnic, religious, or racial group, right? It's difficult to say that there's a genocide going on in Syria perpetrated by the Assad regime. But it's hard to imagine a scenario in which the Assad regime collapses and a genocide or attempted genocide against the Alawite minority does not occur. Right? Ibn Taymiyyah, the ideologue of a lot of the Takfiris fighting in Syria, is he writes on the Alawites and talks about them being unbelievers. It's hard to imagine not just Daesh, right, the Islamic State in Iraq and the Sham, but other groups who the U.S. and our allies in the region are supporting, going after the Alawites and massacring them in huge numbers. So one way to interpret the U.S. and Western non-involvement in Syria is explicitly to prevent the genocide that I think will almost inevitably occur if the Assad regime falls.
Let's have answers to these questions, and then we'll go to another set of questions. Any of the panelists? Okay.
Well, I think I don't want to. All these questions
You know,
are addressed to you.
The last time I met the last speaker, you should all know, was at a panel on Syria, in which he knew a lot more than I did. So I suspect you're right, David. Maybe the Syrian example, in terms of my bringing it up as, you know, in the context of sort of Western passivity, maybe the Syrian example is not the best example because it is much murkier than a straightforward case of, you know, something like Burma that John speaks about, where there's clearly a minority, a clear part of the population is the clearly aggrieved party, and a foreign intervention would be clear. I doubt that the reasons for non-intervention in the West are strategic, or, you know, I stand by my argument that there's just no appetite for any kind of intervention because in the U.S. because of the Iraq and Afghan wars. And that's what I would say very briefly to the question in the back there as well. But maybe.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I think that you know, the examples that were given in terms of, you know, Burma, Syria, and all that, point to the problem that, you know, of course, when something is happening, there are differences in terms of trying to interpret what's going on. And that emphasizes the need for prevention. That really, the key to all this thing is to promote good governance, promote zero tolerance for any of these things, so that, in fact, you prevent this happening. I'm not convinced that the problem in Syria of intervention, I have to differ with you, that it's more, I just, how, if you intervene in Syria today, say by peacekeeping, what will you actually do? You know, fight who? I mean, because there's no peace accord to actually kind of try to look after. So you have that difficulty that I don't think you can put in any army you like, you know, in Syria today, because the fighting is going on, unless you're asking the army to take one side. I mean, I don't see what they would actually be doing. And to me, this points really to questions of, you know, prevention. And I agree that the U.S. has, you know, the best capacity to intervene, but then actually don't think that we're ever really going to agree in terms of those kind of issues of intervention. And again, that points to me to prevention, because you can see that even in the problems in North Africa, I mean, the international community intervened in Libya, but they did not intervene in Bahrain, in other places where things were actually just as bad. So you can see this problem of, you know, the way countries react to this. And it still remains really a major problem to get consensus in terms of intervening on crisis. Darfur, as you rightly point out, I mean, there's genocide in Darfur, in my view. But you're not going to get intervention there because, you know, countries don't think that it's important to them. I mean, those that have the capacity to do so.
Well, I will just follow from where you ended with Darfur. I mean, there is no doubt that when Kasese submitted his report, the Commission of Inquiry, at the time he did not conclude that there was a genocide. But at the end of the day, the case, when it was brought before the ICC, the charges were confirmed for genocide. A warrant of arrest was issued. And as I said earlier, today there are countries where President Bashir can work freely. Had he had gone to South Africa, I can tell you he would have been arrested at the time of the swearing ceremony of President Zuma, because South Africa is a rule of law state. And President Zuma was warned clearly, if he comes here, he will be arrested. But there are countries where he can work freely. He can work freely in most of the Arab countries. He can go to China. He can go in other places. But that is why it is extremely important that those states which have ratified the Rome Treaty make it clearly that to respect their obligations. And that's why also my friend Ndulo is right when he said the R2P existed. In fact, the R2P is simply a renewal of a commitment, because these are obligations which are already contained in most of the instruments. The world leaders agreed in 2005 that no longer we will sit down and watch populations who are facing risk of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crime, ethnic cleansing to be killed. But at the same time, as you said, they also made a compromise when it comes to the use of force, the pillar number 3, where it said on a case by case. So what does it mean? That means clearly that when these issues are brought before the Security Council, where you have 5 members which have the right to veto, they will certainly look into, well, their own selfish interest. And that's why I don't think really it is because of they are afraid that the day after there will be a risk of a genocide in Syria. That is not why they have not been acting. There have been calls which were made, but of course Russia did not want any intervention. And I'm not sure, of course, that even USA would like to have such an intervention. But that is to say, on the ground, that is not. But you are right, and I have issued statement in the early days saying we have to be extremely careful, because the day after that is where there is such risk. And at the same time, I issued another statement calling for a stop of the religious rhetorics in the region, because that division. So there is a risk, and we have to look into it, and we are looking into it. The other aspect you mentioned about Myanmar, the condition of the Rohingya, and which now has gone beyond even, because even those Burmese of Indian origin who are Muslim are also being targeted. And Aung San Suu Kyi, I may say, she's really a shame today to all of us. She was the icon. We fought for Aung San Suu Kyi when I was head of the International Commission of Juries. With Sonny Ramphal, we even wanted her just to give her some kind of a protection to be a member of the board of directors of International IDEA, International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, based in Stockholm. She participated in one-hour meeting while she was in the house of arrest by phone. But today, she is in love with some of the radical military in Burma. But we have to look and continue to do everything possible. But then you take Asia, which is a bit different from Africa. But even in Asia, you have now some courageous people who are emerging. And things will change even in Asia, sooner or later. I mean, the world cannot continue to accept to having these two balances. And that's why right now there is an ongoing discussion, which I'm sure will end sooner or later on the formal desk of the Security Council members regarding a kind of a code of conduct for the members of the Security Council. And when we say members, that's the 5. To make sure that every member which have the right to veto will refrain using that veto when there are people who are at risk of atrocity crimes. It may take a long time. Some will argue, well, if you look why the veto was introduced in 1945, it did not exist during the time of the League of Nations. The League of Nations failed partly. So all type of arguments. But I think what is needed is we need to come with a strong movement at the end of the day. We need to make sure that the people around this world, that's where the civil society, the youth, the women's group, the religious, I mean, at the end of the day, we need to have really a very powerful movement. And with the fall of the Berlin Wall, with the end of the ideologies, we are seeing some kind of unbalance. And that's where we need, I think, to get mobilized. Another important aspect which he raised and about the Great Lake region, they draw the lessons also from Rwanda. And because, as you said, 5.4 million people died after the genocide, as a result also, not only, they committed to adopt a protocol for the prevention of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crime, and all forms of discrimination. So the 11 members of the Great Lake region which were involved in that war. And today my office is supporting 5 national committees, including also the regional committee which is seated in Bujumbura. Their role is mainly to make sure that they can scan, what is happening in their respective country, identifying the risk factors which, if they are not addressed, may lead to atrocity crimes. Last week I was in Bujumbura to alert, say, guys, be careful. We have this and this information. I mean, these are things, of course, we don't publicize, but we are reflecting on those issues. An important aspect, and I conclude with that, is the role of the academics. When I joined this office in New York, I realized that the United Nations is a bit weak when it comes to strategic analysis. And that's where I thought it is extremely important that we made good use of the researchers and to help in the analysis. And I have, for instance, amended recently our framework of analysis, which you can find on our website, where you will have all the risk factors. And the recent risk factors I included is the religious risk factor, the manipulation of religion. Not religion, but the manipulation of religion. We are witnessing it in the Sahel region. We are seeing it, as we said, today in Myanmar. Who would have believed that the Buddhists will become violent, calling for killings? Nobody. But it is there, manipulating religion.
Okay, let me have another 3. The last 3 sets of questions.
Want to say something?
You raise your hand, go ahead. Yeah. Make it brief.
Well, actually, I'll refrain from not asking visibly. It's more of a theoretical question, more about authoritative governments. A lot of the things that we've mentioned were more dealing with authoritative governments, and maybe, based on my experience in Rwanda, it's better to table and ask somebody directly.
Okay. Any more questions? Go ahead.
So why did the U.S. intervene in Kosovo but not in Rwanda? Was it due to race, or is there a Marx explanation on Monsanto's economic imperialism in the Balkans? Or was Clinton using divergent foreign policies to distract from scandals at home, or was there just a real explanation that Kosovo was a strategic location?
The last question here, sir.
We've talked about political structures, political will, rule of law, organizational intervention. What's being done on the educational level, the community level, the NGO level, and the grassroots level? I think because that ultimately is going to decide whether people choose to get along.
Brief answers from the panelists.
Just concluded an agreement with UNESCO to launch a program of education to Holocaust and to the prevention of genocide. Because, as you said, education is key. On the second question regarding Kosovo, I will ask you to go back to the second debate of the presidential election between Al Gore and Bush. Bush did say, well, Africa is not within our sphere of interest. Al Gore said, well, we had ally in Bosnia who would have do the thing together. And the truth is that they were not at all ready. They had the Somali syndrome, which were behind the mind of those people at the White House, the advisors, the security advisors. It was for them out of question that an American soldier go and dying for these African Rwandese after what happened to Somalia. That is my reading. That is why they did not intervene in Rwanda.
Just to agree that education is very important. That, I think that I agree with Adam that we need to work on this. And but on the interventions, I would like to add that from my experience, there's still really a lot of difference in terms of allocating resources to problems in the third world, and if a problem arises in Europe. Even yesterday I was talking to somebody at the World Food Program, and they have comparing the programs in terms of Syria and the Central African Republic, that if you look at the refugees there, around that region, it's like 16 million, and over in Syria it's like maybe 6 million, but the resources in the other places less than 10 million, and the other places like 2-3 billion. So you see this gap. You also see it in the example of Kosovo that you give in resources. When I was in Kosovo, having said both in Kosovo and in East Timor, I could compare the resources for East Timor, the whole country. The resources we had there, I think, were equivalent to just one town in Kosovo, that's Pristina. This is completely different, in terms of allocation of resources. This continues to be a major problem, and you also see it even in the peacekeeping. That really peacekeeping is very structured. It's like an apparated structure in the sense that if you look at the soldiers that are actually in Sudan and all that, they are largely from the third world. And the Western countries don't actually, they give the resources, but not the soldiers, and that's just, sorry?
The U.S. doesn't give any soldiers at all.
No, the U.S. doesn't give soldiers. Where? Which mission does it?
No.
No,
our soldiers be under the...
Yeah, they pay, they give the money back, but in terms of, so it's like, we'll send the money, but you guys find the people to go do this. And all the missions are like that, and so we still have a lot of work to do in terms of the world, really, to look at these situations the same way.
With that, let's express our appreciation.
But I think it will be unfair to the US government today to not mention another lesson learned, that is the establishment of the Atrocity Prevention Board by the Obama administration, which is in place and which is working closely with us. And I can tell you, things are not sometimes easy, but there is a move in the direction of addressing the risk factors at things are working at that level. And I think that is something we have to also acknowledge. And another initiative is the newly launched initiative of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon called the Rights Up Front. In other words, you guys working as resident coordinator, being UN staff on the ground, don't keep silent. When there are risks, go and discuss it. If the authorities don't act, come back, alert New York, and New York will act. Because the UN failed it in Sri Lanka. 30,000 people, Tamil, were being killed on the eyes of the people of the world.
Okay, with that, let's express our appreciation to our speakers. And thank you for coming.